Thank you, Peyton, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on sales forecasting and best practices for restaurants. And as we go through the material here in the next 45 minutes or hour or so, several considerations when it comes to forecasting. And in my view, the most important system you have is sales forecasting in terms of developing your business, your team, controlling your costs, and oftentimes a forgotten or taken for granted system. And when you think about it, your sales forecasting dictates how you schedule your team, how you manage your labor, how you order and produce your food, clean and maintain your restaurant, train and develop your team, caring for your team, caring for your guests, your own personal quality of life, both personal and while at work. So let's consider those things as we walk through today's webinar. And our learnings today are on these 3 points: how to develop a sales forecasting toolbox, how to measure the success of your forecast and the cost of missing your forecast, some of which is extremely obvious to us as restaurant operators, and some things here that may catch your attention as it relates to the overall execution of your restaurant or your team. So let's start out by answering the question, what is in your toolbox, your forecasting toolbox? And we have this in 4 different buckets. We have a forecast bucket, which includes weather and menu mix, a competitor activity bucket, which we include coupons and competitive intrusion or competitor activity in general, sales trends, considering last year's sales, current comp sales, and a 4 to 6 week average, and we have some other tools to discuss in there as well. And then calendars, marketing calendars, community calendars, holidays, annual and day part trends, and then also considering other things that impact us depending upon where our location is. If you're in the North or Midwest, perhaps snowfall, road construction pretty much anywhere across the country, and any public relations event. So we'll look at each of those 4 items one at a time. And we'll start with the toolbox regarding calendars and work our way through here. Community calendars, we're talking about school schedules, and this may be not quite as obvious as you might think. Schools at all degrees, preschool all the way up to colleges and universities in your area, that may have events that either draw people to or away from your restaurant. And then the same would hold true with community events, anything that's going on in your restaurant community that would draw people either to or away from your restaurant. And one thing it really needs to be considered here is many of us work in restaurants in the communities that we don't live in. So it's up to us to either take an active role in community and understand what's going on, or communicate with or have community captains on our team, if you will, to help us keep abreast as to what's going on that will impact our sales and our forecasting. From a marketing perspective, LTO schedules. Be in a position to build your forecast based on the items that you're going to be selling for an LT item or a new product launch. Following your brand forecasts that are typically given to you as part of those launches, so you're prepared to meet the sales demand and the product demand. And then federal and religious holidays. And there's really a lot going on with the holiday portion of our business as it relates to forecasting. And I want to start by talking about the Memorial Day and the Labor Day weekends, typically impacted depending upon where you're at. If you're a highway location, travel comes into play. So Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening, maybe into Friday, and then the day of the holiday that evening. Understanding when people are coming back based on your sales history and how that'll impact your sales forecasting and your sales is critically important. 4th of July, something that need to be considered depending upon what day of the week it falls on. People extend their weekends when the 4th of July is on Friday and Monday, and maybe not so much on any other day that the 4th of July falls, with exception, of course, of the weekend. And then weather, how does that come into play on the 4th of July? The other thing to consider on something like the 4th of July is slow business during the day. What happens on the late evening before, during, and after fireworks, if you have those in your general area. So important things to consider there. One thing often overlooked when it comes to sales forecasting is the federal holidays, the Martin Luther King days, the Veteran days, the President's days, typically on a Monday. And oftentimes, depending upon your restaurant, will bring different things on that business day. Oftentimes, it's a normal business day. Oftentimes, it's busier than normal, perhaps slower than normal, or even perhaps from a net sales total standpoint, it's the same, but the business comes differently. So having a process in place or data to be able to look at when the business comes and how it comes on those holidays is critically important. And then finally, the religious holidays, Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving maybe not so much a religious holiday, but a special holiday nonetheless. And understanding what happens before those holidays. Thanksgiving, for example, Wednesday before is typically very busy on into the evening and late night if you're a late night provider. If you're open for Thanksgiving, and several of you may be, what does Thanksgiving look like? What time do you open? When do you start to see the guests come in? Make sure that you're set up for success that way. And then Christmas, Christmas Eve. Again, having history in place. If you're open Christmas Eve, how late and why, and Christmas Day, if you're open, when should you open, how late should you stay open, and then what happens the day after Christmas. So being able to understand each of those components from a calendar perspective, from a forecasting perspective, to make sure you set yourself and your team up for success is critically important. Next in our toolbox is forecasts in general. And on this side, you see, two things. One is weather. So understanding as you're looking at writing your schedule for the next week, the best you can, what the weather forecast looks like. If you're writing your schedule, getting into a holiday weekend, what does the forecast look like for that weekend? And build your schedule accordingly, and then have some flexibility if the weather significantly changes as you get closer to executing your schedule. And then the menu mix, and this is something that I found in my career that is very undervalued at the restaurant level and requires some additional coaching from an above-store leader or from somebody at the restaurant level that's got a great deal of experience that values this piece. And typically, when you have a new product or an LTO, your brand will provide for you sales assumptions and sales mix assumptions and allow you the opportunity to enter those into your back office system that will set your forecasting up properly for those items and those sales, which will by extension set you up for success from an ordering standpoint, from a preparation standpoint, and scheduling standpoint to make sure you can meet the sales demands as they are assumed or created by your brand. Next in our toolbox is competitor activity, and I mentioned this at the onset, and several things in consideration here. And one example up at the top there is negative PR, and that doesn't happen a lot where it impacts our business, but it has happened. And one example is here in the Northwest, in the Minneapolis area, I should say, pardon me. Several years ago, there was an E. coli breakout due to shredded lettuce down in Iowa. That had nothing to do with the Taco Bell location, but the Taco Bell locations were dramatically impacted by the negative PR because it was a taco brand, again, not a Taco Bell brand, and the shredded lettuce and the E. coli and people getting sick and so on. And we were negatively impacted for 7 to 10 days while we worked through that, and our guests understanding that it wasn't related to us, and they started to come back to us slowly. So we were in a position there where our sales were forecasted. We had to readjust those forecasts really on a daily basis to adjust the scheduled labor and to adjust the food that was produced for those days to protect our profits. Opening and closing restaurants, critically important to understand when those are happening, opening, if you're a quick service provider and you've got a competitor opening near you, you may feel a dip in sales for the first week, 10 days, 2 weeks, maybe even beyond that, something to consider. And then closing. Have you got a competitor closing within the area that may draw people to your restaurant? And we had a situation, a personal experience with this one last year in the city of Minneapolis. We had a Wendy's close a half mile from a Taco Bell location. And the restaurant general manager, who happens to live in that area, was just all over that. He had the date of the closure. He actually was able to hire a couple of the employees, but he put himself from a forecasting standpoint into a really great position. Granted, he was guessing as to how much the sales would go up, but he did forecast and put himself in a position where he had enough product and then he had enough people on to meet the additional sales demands. And because he did a good job with that, his sales continue to stay strong relative to last year, going against that store closing. And then the positive PR, and thinking about positive PR, thinking about a couple of brands that we're close to, one being IHOP. If you're an IHOP or near an IHOP and a competitor of IHOP, when they have their free pancake day on their anniversary date, that may, obviously for IHOP, it draws people to you. If you're a competitor of IHOP, it might draw people away from you that day. So understanding that and being able to schedule, or rather forecast and schedule against that, is critically important. And then coupons, and that would really apply to any of you out there that perhaps in the pizza business, for example, that rely on coupons, or in a very competitive industry that does rely on coupons. Understanding what others are offering and how that may or may not impact your forecasting is very, very important. Next in our toolbox is sales. And here we're talking about that last year's sales and having a history, and even day part mix sales. And there are web-based solutions, and we here at Delegate have two of them to help us with last year's sales and trends and day parts, to really drill into when the sales are coming on any given day and how they're trending. And trending is extremely important when you're getting into summer, coming out of summer, when school starts. You see obviously shifts in our customer behavior and the traffic patterns, late night, evening, into the afternoon occasionally, working backwards. It's important to understand when those trends take place and how they impact your forecasting of business by extension. And if you're in a situation where you don't have those web-based solutions, it's a great best practice. And I used years ago, before we had all this computer technology, where we used to track all this stuff in a store record keeping book that stayed in the restaurant to help managers as they were transferred about or coming new into the system, where we had the sales for the holidays tracked and any other notes, weather related, any surprises or any facts that might help us understand the business next year. And as I mentioned, if you've got a web-based solution to help you with that, that's even all the better. One of the things to consider, and it's really important to have notes for when it comes to last year's sales, is there may have been something going on. You might be comping your sales significantly higher or lower than last year, and it may be because you're going up against a store opening last year, or closing, or road construction, or something along those lines that positively or negatively affected your sales and by extension your forecast. 4 to 6 week average is typically a default in building your schedule. Can certainly be effective in building your forecast and your schedule within the framework of using the calendars that we described earlier. And a great example now, and we're in that time of year, if you're building your schedule for the middle of September and you're using a 4 to 6 week average, you're probably going to be over forecasted in most brands, as typically right after school starts, at least in the quick service business, we see a dip in sales and transactions as people are getting reacclimated to their personal schedules around their family and the school and school activities and those types of things. So 4 to 6 week average, as I said, important tool to use, understanding where that fits in with last year's sales trends, with your marketing calendar, and and with the seasonality that you're faced with, again, at this time of year is just a classic example there. And then the last point here when it comes to sales, when you've collected all this data and you have a system in place for looking at how you're going to build your forecast, it's really important that you personally and that you work with your team on believing the numbers and just try to, as much as you can, to keep the emotion out of the forecast. It's just hard for some folks to be so busy in August and 2 weeks later see a significant change in their sales, and oftentimes over forecasted if you allow them to do it, if you don't catch it or coach them through it. And we have food related issues, both cost and waste related, maybe even food safety related, and labor issues, because we're in a position where we have so much sales forecasted that we're just way over scheduled and way over ordered and prepped. So believe in what the history is telling you when you're looking at your history and all the data points available to you that we've touched on so far. So far we've talked about the 4 tools, main tools, and sub-tools in your toolbox as it relates to building a forecast. We're going to get into a minute here setting goals and measuring success, but before we do, I'm going to turn it back over to Peyton. She has a polling question for you.
Great, thank you, Ed. Our first polling question today is, are you currently leveraging metrics or analytics from your restaurant to build and measure the success of your sales forecast? And I will open up that poll now for about 30 seconds. We'll leave that open. You can answer yes or no. We'll just hang on for a couple seconds before we get back to the presentation. During this time while you're answering, I just want to remind you that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will provide it to you with a copy of the slides in a follow-up email in the next couple of days. So just so you're aware of that. We'll hang on here for a couple more seconds before we get back into the presentation. Alrighty, Ed, if you want to take it back, we'll get going with the presentation again.
Okay, and talking about setting goals and measuring success, critically important to everything we do, right? When we have an expectation, we've got have to have a way to measure it and help the team understand how effective they are in executing. So in our example today in sales forecasting, to understand how effective our forecasting is, we need to look at various metrics, and essentially we need to look at 2. One is your actual sales, and one is your forecasted sales. And the number that I'm going to get to here shortly, when you talk about a variance in forecasted versus actual sales, we would love to be at 0, right? Well, the number that you're going to hear, or numbers or range you're going to see, is plus or minus 3 to 5% as a high-end number for a daily or weekly forecasting variance. What I wanted to share with you before we got into that was ineffective forecasting, and this is from an actual client of ours here at Delegate, looking at a 16-day trend of forecasting variances, and you can see several double-digit negative forecasting days here, and this is clearly an example of somebody that either has an empty toolbox when it comes to forecasting, or doesn't understand how to use the tools, or just has no regard at all for forecasting. And typically, when you see these types of numbers, we've got issues all the way from ordering to scheduling to employee morale, and when those things are all going awry, clearly the customer feels it and your P&L feels it as well. No way to run a business. So in terms of measuring your actual versus your forecasted sales, we have a very basic calculation. Your actual sales minus your forecasted sales divided by your forecasted sales gets you your variance percent. So how accurate are you? And I suggest that you look at this variance every day. If you have a web-based solution, or even your POS could probably provide this for you, you could dig into your variance on a day part basis and really understand the details of your business and how you're forecasting not only each of the individual days, but the day parts within the day part. And if you're a quick service restaurant, and I can use Taco Bell as an example, where you're open from 6 or 7 in the morning till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, it's really important now more than ever to understand your forecast from a day part standpoint as well as the day. And I mentioned a few minutes ago the percentage should always be on the slide. It says plus or minus 5%. 0 is a great place to be. Plus or minus 3 to 5%. I've always found most effective in managing our business. So sales forecasting goals, how big is your window? And this may come in handy as you're looking at a specific day and wondering, you've got all these data points, what do I forecast for today with all these data points and what I think is going to happen. On a $5,000 day, a 3% variance to forecast gives you a $300 window. Keep in mind we're talking about plus or minus 3%. So now we're talking about between $4,850 and $5,150. Somewhere in there on a $5,000 day would be that $300 window. And then in the 5% example on a $5,000 day, you have a $500 window between $4,750 and $5,250. And understanding what that window is with regard to what your goal is for forecast, you could forecast in the middle of it, and you stand a much better chance of being in that 3 to 5% range and a much better chance of forecasting your ordering, your prepping, and your employees from a scheduling standpoint. So in terms of measuring success on your forecast, there's several ways to look at it, and the best way is to look at it every day, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Reviewing your metrics daily, get better control of your business. Drilling down to the day parts is great. Analytics could certainly help you do that. Simply having a system and disciplining yourself to look at it every day is a great best practice. Years ago, as an above store leader, I measured the forecasted variance versus the forecast versus the schedule and the variance. I said schedule, I meant actual. The forecasted versus the actual, I apologize. And the variance on the team on a regular basis, so they could see weekly how they did relative to their peers, how they did relative to their goals, and then we tie that back into the success of their restaurant operations that week, or perhaps lack of success, and how the forecasting affected that from the schedule all the way through the execution to the customer experience. Beyond looking at forecasting on a daily basis, look at it for your ordering cycle. If you have a 3 or a 4 or a 5-day order cycle, is your variance to forecast in that 3 to 5% range? If it is, and assuming that your ordering practices are in place, you stand a much better chance of having enough product to get you through your next order cycle, put you in a position where you're not borrowing product, and also have you in a position where you're not tying up your organization's revenue or money by having too much product on your shelves because of a forecasting or an ordering issue. Weekly effectiveness is best. Not worded exactly clearly here on the slide. I apologize for that. If you're in the 3 to 5% range, for sure, if you're looking at it from a weekly standpoint, but the best way to measure your success is daily. You may end up in a position looking at the 7 days within a week where your variance is 3 to 5%. But if you haven't hit 3 or 5% more than 4 or 5 times, then you're not doing a great job you're not effectively forecasting your schedule on a day-to-day basis. So that's something to consider if you're going to use the weekly variance to measure your success. The cost of missing your forecast. The obvious one that's not on here, it should be right at the top, is labor. Missing your forecast obviously causes us some pain there, and we'll spend a little bit more time talking about that here shortly. But thinking about, and unfortunately we have bad days in our business, and did you ever have a bad day and wonder why, beyond people not coming to work or coming to work on time? And I found that in reviewing previous days' success or lack thereof and struggles, the last place that inexperienced managers look, or people that just don't understand our business yet or don't value forecasting, forecasting is the last place that they look. And again, as I said at the beginning, it may be the most important and undervalued tool that you have to set your team up for success. Up on the screen, we're talking about cash. Forecasting issues may create deployment issues. Now you have too many hands in the tills, creating cash issues. Maybe a situation where you're too busy, too hectic, and the managers in charge are not in a position to audit the safe, so you've got some accountability issues there. If you're scrambling because you're shorthanded and you're underscheduled for the demands of your business and your customer experience is compromised, and right on down the line. Additional costs in forecasting issues, ordering and prepping. I'm relatively certain that nobody on this call writes or builds into their schedule each week time to borrow product. Ordering is a topic for another day, but the forecasting part of this to put you in a position where you, again, assuming that your ordering practices are in place, where you have the sales and the forecast of whatever your LTO item is or new product launch item is, to put you in a position to have the product when you need it the most. As you get into the first weekend of a launch, and typically in the LTO world, it's week 2 and week 3 of the offer that are the most significant from a sales and a product standpoint, and understanding that from a forecast standpoint is really important to make sure that you have enough product and to have that accuracy in place from a forecasting standpoint, so you're not overproducing, over-prepping, and putting yourself in a position where you're compromising your brand standards or even creating food safety related issues because of time and temperature product on the line or in the cooler beyond its prescribed time. Okay, we'll talk a little bit here about forecasting as it relates to the schedule. And, there's two things, well, there's lots of things going on, but the two things I want to touch on is there's the actual sales forecast and then the building of the schedule and then the executing the schedule that is critically important to take forecasting all the way through to the customer experience. So as you're building your schedule, you see those points up there on the board, or on your computer screen, pardon me. Time for employee development, labor costs aligned with metric goals, critically important, organization, proper amount of prep, and less food waste. And the two of these work together, and a great schedule includes training of new hires, cross-training of existing staff, development of management team, time and detail cleaning, and all within the framework of running the business and caring for customers. So what does this have to do with forecasting? When you have large variances on the upside or the downside of a missed forecast, this is what this can look like. If you're over forecasted, you have much less sales than forecast. You are in a position where you're cutting labor. So in cutting labor, you're sending people home, perhaps eliminating training or development with your team. Perhaps removing a much needed meeting from your daily plan, reducing your resources for detailed cleaning or organization. And again, perhaps food safety or food cost issues due to over-prepping, overproduction. If you're in a position where you're under forecast, you have more sales in your forecast. Now you have the exact opposite of what we just shared. You're asking, perhaps insisting your team work harder. You're asking your team to stay later. You're asking your team to come in earlier, or sometimes just calling and begging them to come in. You personally staying later, coming in earlier, or perhaps even coming in on your day off. Employee training is compromised. Development is compromised. All hands are on deck serving the guest. And oftentimes in these situations, you have the wrong person in front of the guest at the wrong time, compromising the customer experience and compromising the employee experience by putting them in a really bad situation. Meetings get canceled, or meeting perhaps at your above store leader level are unattended because you're stuck in your restaurant. You have cleanliness and organizational issues. You're scrambling to manage your product to keep up with demand. That creates waste, creates mistakes, and perhaps even an employee accident when you're running around with your chicken like a chicken with your head cut off because you are up against a forecasting mistake. And all of this, obviously, if your employees and your managers are feeling this pain, by extension, your customers are feeling pain. So there's the cost of both sides of over and under forecasting laid out for you. So that brings us to an end, and before we get into the opportunity to answer questions, get into the conclusion here, and that is to arm yourself with the tools you need for an accurate forecast. And those are those 4 things we talked about at the beginning: the calendars, sales trends, competitor activity, and forecasts. Measure your success with daily data analytics and variances, and again, looking at the daily numbers and drilling into the day parts is extremely effective. And then to stay flexible, adjust your employee schedules to accommodate forecasting. And when you see things come up like last minute road construction or snow that's falling either harder or earlier than forecasted, and adjust. If you can't electronically adjust your forecast, you can certainly manually adjust the forecast and adjust your prep levels and your schedule accordingly to protect the profit side of your business. And then bend with your unforeseen circumstances, which basically covers my previous point of just being flexible with your schedule. So that concludes my portion with the questions. I'll turn it back over to Peyton.
Great, thank you, Ed. Before we get into questions, we have one more polling question for you. Are you interested in having a conversation with Delegate about how you can leverage data analytics and improve your sales forecast? And we'll leave that open for a couple seconds here. Go ahead and answer that polling question. And if you have any questions, this is the time to type it in the box on the side panel. Looks like we have a couple lined up already, so you definitely still have time to ask those questions if you have any. All right, I'm going to close the poll here in about 5 seconds. And we will get into questions now. I have one here. So Ed, you talked about taking marketing campaigns into consideration when you're doing forecasting, and obviously that can help our business, but how should we take into competitors' marketing campaigns when we're building out our sales forecast? What are some things we need to think about in regards to their marketing efforts?
If there's a big product launch, paying attention to commercials, both radio and TV, critically important. If you're in a situation where you don't live in the community in which you work, having somebody dialed in into the coupon activity and your competitor activity in the local area that may affect your restaurant is really important. And just being sensitive to that and having an understanding, it may not affect your overall forecast as you're building your schedule and your forecast for the week, but understanding if you see a dip in sales at the beginning of whatever that launch or offer is, that you may want to look at adjusting your forecast on a daily basis until your sales level off. Great.
We have another question here. When you were an above store leader, how did you measure and communicate sales forecasting variances?
That was just something that I mentioned briefly during the webinar that I, as an above store leader, tracked on a weekly basis. And it was just a simple, before the computer days, it was just a manual process. In the computer days, it's a web-based, not web-based, an Excel spreadsheet with actual and forecasted sales, and creating a variance and then being able to dig into the days as needed to help them understand what their variances were. And, it takes a little bit of work because in an above store leader, I was in a position where I had to monitor the sales every day, which you do anyway, but I had to collect the schedules and transfer the sales forecast to whatever tracking system I was using. So it took a little bit of work, but I found over time, as we all know, when your team, as an above store leader anyway, when your team knows that you're looking and you're coaching them through, they take better care to make sure that they're either learning or executing the system or standard better.
All right, we have another question here. Can you speak to new store openings and forecasting sales for a brand new unit?
Boy, that's a really tricky question. Typically, my experience is new store openings is over forecast whatever your expectations are, and put yourself in a position. We only have one opportunity to open a store right, and we had a situation with an organization that I'm close to here. They opened up a Taco Bell restaurant on Friday last week, and Saturday they did $11,000 in sales, and they were forecasted to do a little bit more than that. So they were in pretty good shape in that regard. So I wish I had a more definitive answer there. Your organization or your team may have some more insight there. Forecast high, and put yourself in a position that you have the staff scheduled, assuming you're trained or in process of training, and that you have the product available, so you don't have product shortage. Now, the other part of that is, if you're over forecasted, you might find yourself in a position where you have too much product on hand, and you would need to work through that with either your supplier or your neighboring restaurants to help alleviate some of the issues that might be associated with that.
Excellent. We had a couple other more specific questions, so we will reach out to you guys individually for those. But if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to reach out to us, send us an email, give us a call. We'll get all your questions answered. And that brings us to the end of today's presentation. So I just want to say thank you again to Ed. That was great information, and thank you to all of today's participants. And again, just a reminder that the presentation is being recorded and will be sent to you within the next couple days, so you can take a look at the slides and watch any of the presentation that you'd like to look at again. For more information on Delegate Solutions that can help you with your sales forecasting process, please visit us at www.delegate.com. And that concludes today's webinar. Again, we just want to say thank you. And if you have a moment, take that short survey that pops up once you close out of the webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody.